Back in high school that I first began to feel what I knew was a burden and continued to pray about it and discover that it was a burden from God that confirmed itself in a call from God on my life to serve Him as a preacher. And it took a period of time before I was confident in that and knew in my heart that that's what God wanted to use my life to be. And so I'd shared that with my family. I shared that with my church. And so in high school and then certainly more in college because of that, I began to get some opportunities to preach. And anytime those opportunities revealed themselves, I was super excited about that. I mean, because they didn't come around that often. And so I was super excited when I would get an opportunity to preach, but I was left with a dilemma. Though I'd heard thousands of sermons before in my life, I didn't know how to preach. Nobody had ever sat down and said, "Hey, Michael, let me give you some tips. Let me share with you. This is a way to kind of deal with a passage, to think through it. When it comes time to share a message, these are some things that you may want to think of." I never had any of that. And so I would get these opportunities to preach, and I didn't know how to. So what did I do? I just preached other people's sermons. And so some of these were those that I would watch on TV. I used to, when I was in high school and college, every Sunday while I was at church, I would tape Bellevue Baptist, where Adrian Rogers was the pastor. And every Sunday I would get home that afternoon and I would watch Adrian preach. And if it was really good, I would take copious notes and I would preach that sermon later. Sometimes it would be something that I would hear on the radio, and it may be Charles Stanley, Chuck Swindoll, David Jeremiah. So one day I would hear something, "Oh, that's really good. I could do something with that," and so I would preach their sermon, hoping that others had not listened to the same program. In addition, I don't know if you're aware of this, you can go to Lifeway tomorrow and you'll see there, but you can look online, there are thousands of books, of published books of sermons that preachers have written over the years. And unfortunately today, there are a lot of preachers sharing some of those sermons. But anyway, at that point, that's all I knew what to do. I had no resources. I had no tools in my tool belt, and so that's what I would do. And I remember, speaking of those books of sermons, when I was in college, of course, Shep and I were at Gardner-Webb together. There was a book that he had whose title I have always remembered. It was this: "If I Had Only One Sermon to Preach." And the premise of the book was very simple. The editors had gone to interview or solicit from prominent Baptist preachers across the country with this question: if you had only one opportunity to stand before a congregation again, one opportunity to preach, what would that sermon be? What is it that you would share? And so then they took those messages, put them in a book, and bound that. I remember thumbing through that book at some point. I never read completely any of those sermons, never preached any of those. I'm sure Shep has, but that title has stuck with me all these years. And every once in a while, that title will go through my mind with this question: if I had only one opportunity to preach again, what is it that I would say? What sermon would I share? I believe, quite frankly, at this stage in ministry, what I feel burdened by God to share with you today would be that message. I want you to understand, I don't say this lightly. I choose my words carefully. I sincerely believe that what I'm sharing with you today is the fruit of a burden that God has put on my heart. I haven't sat down and said, what is it that Michael wants to say? But really, I felt so burdened by God that He's leading me in this particular direction. We're going to take a break from the life of Saul today. But that being said, I believe we're still going to be in keeping with the theme of what we've been talking about for weeks. This whole idea of lone rangers, living independently from God. The second thing I'd have you consider is this. I want you to recognize at the outset that we're going to be talking about some issues and talking about some challenges, and specifically some of those as they're manifest in our church family. But recognize that we do not have a monopoly as a church on any or all of these challenges. Unfortunately, I believe them to be epidemic in the evangelical church. I believe it's widespread. I can't imagine the church where these things aren't present. That's a burdensome thought. But the reality is, God hasn't called me to be the pastor of the evangelical church. He's called me to be Gate City's pastor. And so I shared this today with you as a burden from God about our condition, where we are, where you are. If you would, grab a Bible with me and turn to 2 Timothy chapter 3. 2 Timothy chapter 3. If you have a Bible, great. If you brought one, that's wonderful. If you didn't, I want you to grab a Bible in front of you. I want us all to be looking at this passage together. 2 Timothy chapter 3, and we're going to begin reading with verse 1. What I want to do is just first kind of walk you through this passage. 2 Timothy chapter 3. You know, this is a book of the Bible, and a lot of times we think of books differently in terms of categories and other things. You may be further aware that not only is this considered to be a book of the Bible, but it's considered one of the pastoral epistles. The word epistle just means letter. It's a pastoral letter. And Paul is writing to Timothy, and he is giving him counsel, encouragement, and direction as he's becoming a leader within the early church. And with that as backdrop, he tells Timothy this, and I'm reading from the ESV today. He says, Timothy, understand this. In the last days, there will come times of difficulty. Now, don't get lost in that phrase, in the last days. There are repeated instances, in fact, collectively through the New Testament. That phrase, the last days, doesn't simply refer to a brief season of time just before the return of Christ. It's all the time from Christ's ascension until He returns again. Whether that's a day, a month, a decade, a century, a millennia, or 10 millennia. So in that span of time, he tells Timothy, I want you to know, understand this, there's going to be difficulty. And this is the reason why. He said, people will be lovers of self. They'll be self-absorbed, focused only on themselves. They'll be lovers of money. They'll love stuff, getting more, having more. We'd say materialistic. In terms of their attitude, their dealings with others, their own personal disposition, they're proud and arrogant. And their dealings with others, abusive. That can be physically, can be verbally, emotionally. To those that are still within their parents' household, you will find disobedience to parents, not even recognizing and submitting to the most basic level of authority. In terms of their attitude relative to their blessings, ungrateful. In terms of their discipline in living, unholy. Relative to others, heartless, unappeasable, can't be pleased with anything, have no contentment. Slanderous, speaking all sorts of negative things about others. In terms of their living, without self-control. Brutal in dealing with others, not loving good. Verse 4, he says, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit. And then he says, lovers of pleasure, of comfort. 3 times at this point in those verses, Paul has used the word lovers. He said, first of all, they're lovers of self, self-absorbed, lovers of money, of stuff. And then he says, lovers of comfort. All of these things, he says, more than lovers of God. Verse 5, though, is the kicker. Having the appearance of godliness. So from the distance, if you just kind of blur the backdrop, it appears there is godly behavior and godly living at work. But in truth, it is essence. It is not substance. It only looks that way when in truth it is not. Why? Because he says they deny its power. They deny its power. It appears to be godliness, but it is not, because the power of godliness is denied. Now, there's a couple of ways that we use the word deny. One of them is to refuse to agree with. For example, if you were to say to me, Michael, you have a full head of hair, I would deny that. I would say, no, that's not accurate, that's not true. There's another way that we use the word deny. For example, if we were to be out on the basketball court and you've got the ball and you're going up for a shot, the ball releases from your hands, and because of my athletic skills and prowess, I jump up and I block the ball. I block the shot. I am denying you a basket. I am denying you a goal. In essence, it's saying, that's communicating the idea of preventing, prevention, or blocking. So taken together, Paul says that there are individuals manifesting these characteristics where it seems that godliness is at work, but it's not, because the power of godliness is being blocked. It's being prevented. It's not actually being experienced. And then concerning all of this, he says, avoid such people. A couple of things I'd have you note. First of all, relative to the theme we've been dealing with, we have defined lone rangers as those that are living their lives independent from God, doing things their own way. God, you can keep your seat. I've got all of this down here. So with that in mind, those possessing these characteristics, where these are found, are they lone rangers? Sure they are. Absolutely they are. But here's the second question. Where were these people found? Well, the answer to that question goes back to what we talked about a moment ago. What's the nature of this book of the Bible? It is a pastoral epistle. Paul is, in essence, writing to a fellow pastor. He's talking to a man who is experiencing this, observing this, even within the body. What Paul described for Timothy in the first century, I am burdened about the fact that I see altogether present in the 21st century. Not simply from the distance, from the vantage point, looking collectively at the evangelical world, but even right here. As I read these characteristics that Paul describes, I have, over the past 3.5 years, paid attention enough, observed enough, listened enough, taken in enough, that where Paul gives a characteristic there, I could give you the names and say, there you see it at work. That burdens me. That weighs my heart. But let me see if I can make or paint the picture more broadly for you. And again, let me reiterate, I'm not picking on Gate City. We don't have a monopoly on these challenges. But because these characteristics are found, these characteristics manifest themselves in other ways. Ways that I hope you can recognize, we can all see if we'll be careful enough to look. The first is in the area of biblical illiteracy. And it's not that people are incapable of reading the words of Scripture. It is simply that they do not. Consequently, the depth of, the scope of, and the breadth of biblical ignorance astounds me. I see it at work in our children. It should not be so, but it is true for me to have a children's Sunday school teacher share with me. In my class, I asked them to open their Bibles to Genesis, and to have children that have grown up their entire life in church not be able to find it. That's a problem. But it's not something merely to be found in children's areas, but it's witnessed, and I think it's pervasive among our teens. It's pervasive among our young and median adults. It's even found among our seniors. And especially among our seniors, it ought not be the case. You've been at this a lot longer than any of us. But I believe it was the Joy Group New Year's luncheon. As an icebreaker before everything started, people were given sheets of paper and a pencil and were asked to write the 10 Commandments. Not in order, but just list the 10 Commandments. Do you know how many were able to list all of them? 0. Now, we'll get our panties in a wad if they move a placard at a courthouse that has the 10 Commandments on it. But do you recognize those that say those things are consequential? We can't even tell you what they are. That's a big deal. Now, I understand that there's a lot in this Bible. There's an awful lot in it. There's a lot of names. There's a lot of events. There's genealogies. There's commands. There's promises. There are expectations. There's a lot of pages with a lot of words in it. I get that. I recognize also that the more that you read this, if you're spending a lot of time in the New Testament, some of the details of some of the stuff in the Old Testament or vice versa might get fuzzy. But what astounds me and what burdens me is that some of the most basic foundational ideas of Scripture are not known by our people. I want you to recognize that God has given this to us, and we almost flippantly say this, that it's God's Word. These are the words of God. Do you get that? Do you further get that God has gone to great lengths to ensure that I could have a copy and that you could have a copy of this? I couldn't begin to count. We will never, this side of heaven, be able to begin to count the number of people who have given their lives and paid with their blood for you to have the opportunity to still have a copy of this. And yet we don't know what it says. So many of us don't even know the most basic things of what God has already revealed. And it seems as if we're so consumed with getting more and more truth when we don't even know the truth that He's already revealed. I'm burdened about that. That's a weighty thought. I don't get that. The God that we profess to know has given this book to us. And in it, He reveals Himself and His nature to us. He tells us about His plans and His purposes. He tells us about the standards and the expectations that He's going to measure us against. He tells us how the world began, how we began. He tells us how paradise was given, paradise was lost, but how paradise will one day be restored. In it, He reveals the truth about ourselves, the truth about families. In it, He reveals the pathway to blessings and the recipe for judgment. I hope you understand that we will never, ever, ever reach the measure of God's standards so long as we continue to content ourselves with ignorance of what He has said. As a result of these characteristics that Paul describes communicated to Timothy, because those are present, biblical illiteracy is present. But these characteristics manifest themselves in other ways as well. So many times I get the distinct impression as I am here, obviously on Sunday mornings, and here is a part of what we call worship services. So many times, and this thought burdens me immensely. And it's not that people aren't glad to be here and that you're coming out here out of drudgery or anything. Rather, though, it seems that though you may find enjoyment and pleasure in being here, that what we are doing that we call worship, it is just a routine of things that you're checking off a list. And when I prayed a moment ago and talking about doing things thoughtlessly and mindlessly, that's exactly what so many are doing. Stand up at the right time, sit down at the right time, bow your head when somebody else is praying. Listen when somebody is talking. Let somebody sing to you. Stand up and sing at some point. And relative to singing, something else I just don't quite get. I've not only observed this, but even had people tell me that You know, some of these songs, especially some of those newer songs, I'm not going to sing those. I don't like those. Has it ever occurred to you that not a single song that we ever sing together is for you? Has it ever occurred to you that we're not playing the radio and you find something that you like to listen to and just hold on and enjoy it? It ain't about me. It's not about you. If those words reflect your heart, then you sing them to Him. But so many times we're just going through the rituals. We show up at 10:30 sharp, we leave at 11:45 dull, and nothing is different. But the greatest weight of this burden strikes me in what I observe going on, or more accurately, failing to go on in our families, those that still have children or teens in the home. And again, we don't have a monopoly on this. It is unfortunately and woefully pervasive. But so many, it seems, among parents have this as the mentality. I will not merely come to the church and drop my kids off. I will go to church as well. But I will take my child to their respective class, to a children's Sunday school class, to a youth Bible study. I will drop my child off, and somebody there will tell my child about Jesus. Somebody will open a Bible and reveal to them something about what God has said. Afterwards, I will pick them up, I will take them home, I will feed them, I will fuss with them, I will do all of these things, but there won't be one word about this or one word about Him until you bring them back here. Think with me about that mentality through the lens of Numbers for a moment. That may help you. Suppose in any given week, the maximum number of hours here at this church for your child or for your teen of spiritual investment is 3 hours a week, between Sundays and what we have going on and what we have going on Wednesdays. So let's suppose that you make it a priority that your child is exposed to this level of spiritual investment for 3 hours a week, and that you make it a priority to ensure, to the extent possible, that they are here every week. Now, that being said, I recognize that there are going to be, and you're aware, that there are going to be services that, for example, around the holidays, we may not meet on a particular day, or someone is sick and you can't make it that time, or there's vacation and you're away. But let's suppose you're very faithful, and out of 52 weeks of the year, your child gets 47 weeks. 47 out of 52, that's a good percentage. Of all those weeks, 47 weeks, they get 3 hours a week of spiritual investment. Now, if you were to add that over the course of the year, just think 47 times 3, that's 141 hours. 141 hours. Divide that by 24, and that's 5.8 days. Out of the course of a year, your child gets a full 5.8 days of spiritual investment. But let's just think in round numbers. Let's say it's 6 days. 6 days of the year, your child gets spiritual investment, teaching about God, about His Word, about Jesus. In some ways, 6 days doesn't sound too bad until you run the numbers. 6 out of 365 is 1.7%. 1.7%. Think with me through this. You may have as either the stated or the perceived goal, the felt goal as a parent, for your child to come and know Jesus, to begin a relationship with Him and then grow in that relationship, so that they have such a convictional foundation that as a teen they're able to withstand the temptations and the pressures that they experience during later adolescence. That not only they're able to withstand that, but then they leave your nest and they go off to college and they're away from mom and dad, and there's all the temptations that are experienced there that you have as your goal, your child to be able to survive all of that, to graduate from school, get their own house, start their own family, and then to step back and watch as your child blooms and blossoms as a man or a woman, a Christian man or a woman, leading a Christian, godly home. That may be your stated or perceived goal, but I want you to understand this. That will not happen with 1.7% of their time being spiritual investment. That won't happen. I want you to understand, though, I'm not suggesting then, and I don't want you to think, well, what we need then is more stuff going on here. So we need Sunday school, and we need youth Bible studies, we need Awana, we need kids stuff, we need those things, but then we need to have a Monday through Friday afternoon Bible study for children and for teens, and then on Saturdays we need these workshops. We got to up those hours and create more time and more investment so that we can start on Sundays and do it all over again. I'm not suggesting that you need to spend one more minute here and your child receiving one more minute of spiritual investment here. What I'm saying is they've got to start getting it with you. It's got to get into not the home. It's got to get into your home. It's got to get in your house. It's got to get on your schedule. It's got to become a priority in your home. Do you remember the words of God to and through Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 6? The children of Israel are getting ready to go into the promised land. And God, through Moses, is speaking to his people, and he is giving them a refresher course in some of his standards. Do this, don't do that. These are my commandments. And in Deuteronomy 6, verse 7, God says through Moses to his people, specifically to parents, you shall teach them diligently. That's not accidentally, it's not sporadically. That's consistent, intentional, diligent effort. You shall teach them to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. Now, that's not God saying to his people through Moses, your house has got to look like a church service, and it's going to be one ending Sunday school lesson after another. That's not the command, that's not the expectation, but here it is. That the communication about God and his word, it permeates and saturates the life of the family. That it's not merely something that is done on a Sunday, not merely something that is done on a Wednesday, but when you're driving your kids to school in the morning, when you're taking them for a dental appointment, when you're sitting at the table, when you're sitting in the den and you turn the TV off for a little bit, that the talk of God permeates and saturates the life of the home. Why did God tell his people this? He answers that question for us in Deuteronomy 6, verse 12. That this must happen, God says, so that you will not forget the Lord. This is my concern. We're not even leading our children to come to know and love a God that they can even forget. They don't even know him enough to forget him. Is it any wonder then that we see epidemic levels of children being brought throughout their lives from birth through graduation in high school? The church is an integral part of their life and their routine. But they head off to college, and when they head off to college, they turn their back on the church, they turn their back on God, and they never darken the door of the church, barring a wedding or a funeral, the rest of their lives. Listen, the numbers are staggering. It's epidemic. Why is that? Well, it's because these characteristics are found. It's because those are manifesting themselves not only in biblical illiteracy and going through empty ritual and routine, but because this stuff is not getting its way into the home. It's not getting its way into the family. We are communicating to our children that some things matter. We are communicating to them that school and academics matter. That soccer and basketball and volleyball and football and dance and band and all of these things, those are consequential, But God and this, it's just not that important. We don't have to say that to them with our words. We're proving it with our actions. But what Paul describes manifests itself in other ways as well. I've been here at Gate City as your pastor now for 3.5 years, and I'm grateful that God has blessed this church. And I feel as a personal blessing that He's led so many to become a part of this church family. I'm abundantly grateful for that. And if you've become a part of this church family during that time, know that sincerely I am grateful and I am honored to be your pastor. I am, and we're glad that you're here and that you're part of the family. That being said, I am also keenly aware of the significant numbers that have become a part of this church family. In excess of 90% of those have been those that just joined by moving their membership from another church here. And I get and understand that that's going to happen. There's nothing wrong with that. What is wrong with that is this. Our church is growing, but it's only at the expense primarily of other churches. It's not because we are communicating the truth with others. People that have yet to hear it, who've yet to come to experience it. My concern is that we profess to be subscribers to a truth that we are absolutely unwilling to share. The lingering command of Jesus was simple. He didn't give us a long laundry list. He gave us a very simple and succinct command. And it was to go into Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria. Here, there, everywhere. And He didn't say go start another Sunday school class, another small group, provide another workshop, another seminar, another event, another opportunity. Here, there, and everywhere do what? Make disciples. Disciples of Jesus. People that act like and think like Jesus. My burden is that we are generating a crowd that makes no difference, has no impact, can easily fall away, and produces no offspring. As Paul concludes this list of criteria, he says in verse 5, having the appearance of godliness, but denying its power. And then he concludes with a very short sentence, 3 simple words: avoid such people. Avoid such people. This is the question I kicked around in my mind this past week. If I were to take Paul's directive to Timothy personally, and he said, avoid such people, could I go here? I think the honest truth, and I'm not trying to beat you up with this, I think the honest truth is no. But I couldn't go to the church down the street, one other side of Adams Farm, the other side of town, or the other side of the country, because unfortunately what we're talking about is so pervasive. So we're left with this. What do we do? Where do we go? If these are the problems, if this is the picture, what do we do about it? Well, I believe the first step in this is the expression of absolutely my heart for you. But far more than my heart for you is the burden, I believe, of the heart of God. I want you to know and love Jesus. I don't want you to have another class and another study to memorize more timelines and more genealogies. I want you to know Him and love Him. My concern is that there are, and I believe this with all of my heart, you may be surprised by this, but I believe with all of my heart, there are more than a few people here today who at some point in the past, maybe years ago, perhaps decades ago, a preacher preached, the service came to an end, there was an invitation and an altar call, and you walked down an aisle and took a preacher by the hand, and he rattled off some prayer that you repeated. And after you repeated that prayer, it was pronounced to you that you are a Christian. You now need to get baptized and follow the Lord in believer's baptism. And doing so, you are pronounced a Christian, you were baptized, and made a member of the church. You might have become a member of the church, but my concern is that too many have yet to become a part of God's family. Because when I talk about knowing Him and loving Him, whatever you say you have, or whatever you have told yourself that you possess, it's something other than that. Why? Because to know Him is to love Him. To love Him is to get to the point where you actually seek to know more of Him. Not just stuff about Him, but to know Him. It becomes a priority for you to talk to Him, to listen to Him, to hear Him and seek to hear Him as He wants to speak to you. Knowing and loving Him will manifest itself in a pervasive desire to pattern your life and everything about your life around Him. That's what goes on here, but it's your marriage. It's your parenting. It's your work. It's going to school. That your life is patterned after Him. As I say that, some of you may very well be thinking right at this very moment or feeling something going on inside of you. And you're telling yourself, when Michael was talking about really knowing and loving Him, that's not here. Listen to me in this. Do not squelch that. Do not stifle that. Do not ignore that. That's not Michael doing something. That's God saying something to you. That's God flashing the check engine light on, telling you something is not right. In a few minutes, you're going to have an opportunity to begin getting that light off, getting that problem fixed, and coming to have a relationship with Christ that is real, that's personal, where you know Him and where you love Him. Let me ask you this. If this church had the greatest, most amazing opportunities and events for seniors, if we had the most remarkable opportunities and programming for families and children, if we had the most vibrant programs for teens, but Jesus were not part of the equation, would you still want to be here? My concern is that too many would say, absolutely. Sign me up for that. I want opportunities and events and programmings. That's the problem. Because what we've got to want most is Him. Where everything revolves around Him. As an extension of this, we have to be reminded of, and not merely get into our minds, but etched onto our souls in a way that affects us, what Jesus said in John 15, verse 5. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Nothing of consequence. Nothing of eternal value. Nothing. A few weeks ago, I went to Nashville. They had this pastor's workshop, and 6 times a year they invite 25 pastors to come to Nashville, and it's just a group of 25 pastors that they meet with. And for 3 days, there's this series of sessions. This particular series was on discipleship. But one of the speakers asked this question, and it really struck me. He said, if God didn't show up at your church this week, what would be different? If God didn't show up at your church this week, what would be different? Now, hearing that question burdened me because I felt if I were to answer that honestly, not much, if anything. We'd stand up, we'd sit down, we'd sing, we'd pray, we'd shake hands, we'd hug necks, we'd smile, we'd laugh, we'd walk out. Nothing would be different. Let me ask you as a take on that question, if the Lord were not present in your life this past week, and I hope you honestly recognize that for too many people here today, that's an effective portrayal, because this entire week you've operated without Him. So operating in a week without Him, what would be different? Too many would say nothing. That's a problem. That's indicative of real challenges. After all, Jesus said, apart from me, without me, doing things your own way, living without me, parenting without me, working without me, going to church without me, doing anything without me, nothing of consequence happens. So how do we fix that? Well, we have to not simply recall that and memorize that verse. We've got to live out that truth. For those of you that are Sunday school teachers, first of all, thank you for your willingness to serve in that capacity. But you've got to remind yourself that apart from Jesus, you can't do anything in that small group. Not one blessed thing of consequence. And that it matters more for you to spend time talking to Him than it does spending time in a commentary. Now, I'm not suggesting that you ought not be prepared, that you ought not research, that you ought not think through, and that you ought not plan. I'm not suggesting or minimizing the need for that whatsoever. But I am saying this: if you don't have a word from Him to share, you don't have anything worth saying. Those of you that are part of the choir, now one of your tasks is to be part of leading this congregation into the worship of God. Getting this at play in your life is more than memorizing it, but it's acting on it. And that means that when you're preparing to come here, that you're aware of the fact that it matters more for your heart to be right before Him than it does whether you sing your part perfectly and every note is on pitch. Now, I'm not suggesting that you ought not come to practice and that you ought not rehearse and that we ought not try to give God our very best. He deserves that. But if we're just leaning on our musical skill and abilities, our musical sensibilities and giftedness, nothing of consequence happens. For you that are parents, you still have children, whether they're young or adolescents under your care. This means that you have to tell yourself and act repeatedly based on the notion of what Jesus said, that apart from Him, you can't do anything of consequence in your home or in your children's lives. It means that you come to recognize that your children will not come to know Him. They will not come to know about Him. They will not come to a relationship with Him. They will not grow in Him, and they will not serve Him for their lives when you as a dad and when you as a mom intentionally never talk to God. When you never seek His face and His guidance and ask for His help. When you're not leaning on His standards and communicating His truth with your kids. It's just not going to happen. But why? Because you're doing something apart from Him. And what did Jesus say? Apart from me, how much of consequence is going to happen? Zero. Nothing. Every night when our kids go to bed, we pray with them individually, and the prayer ends every single night the same way. Lord, help him and help her to grow up to have a heart for your will and to be obedient to your word. We recognize we can't do that without Him. You got to get to the point, and you got to get to the place. You can't do this without Him. For weeks we have been looking at the Old Testament figure Saul as an example of Lone Ranger living. It's not somebody that hated God. It's not somebody that intentionally sought to be a bad dude. but he just lived independently from God. And we've been looking back at what we find there in the Old Testament to see this at play, to see that as a case study. Well, the simple truth is, I don't believe we even need to open our Bibles to see Lone Ranger living. Because if we're honest, all we'd have to do is look in the mirror. My burden from God to share with you is that we have collectively become Lone Ranger Baptist Church because we're filled with Lone Rangers. And I want to tell you, as your pastor, I am woefully sick and absolutely tired of doing this without him. My prayer for you is that God is working even now in your heart to make you woefully sick and burdened to action, where you will do nothing apart from Him. That your life as an individual, your life as a family, and our life as a family, it all will revolve around Him. And when we make much of Him, He'll do something of consequence through us. That's my prayer. That's my burden. Will you bow your heads with me this morning?